He used your wedding to make you the suspect.
3 hours after I buried my husband, his lawyer stood on my porch, rain dripping from his coat, and told me the man I had loved since high school had used our wedding to make me the perfect suspect in his murder. My name is Evelyn Carter. I was 73 years old when I married Thomas Bennett, my first love, and the one man I had spent more than half a century trying to forget. For 12 days, I was his wife. On the 13th day, he died in my arms. And by sunset after his funeral, I learned that almost everything he had told me was a lie. Thomas and I grew up in Bellwether, a quiet town in coastal Maine, where everyone knew which family owned which house, whose child had failed algebra, and whose marriage was in trouble before the couple admitted it themselves. He first kissed me behind the high school gym in 1970. He smelled like peppermint and sawdust because he spent his afternoons helping his father build fishing boats. I was 17, careful and obedient. Thomas was 18, restless and impossible to ignore. We promised to leave Bellwether together after graduation. Then his father died. Thomas stayed to save the family business. I left for nursing school in Boston. Letters became phone calls. Phone calls became Christmas cards. Eventually, even those stopped. I married a man named Daniel Carter. We had one daughter, Rachel. Daniel died 6 years before this story began. Thomas married twice, divorced twice, built Bennett Marine into a company worth millions, and became the kind of local legend people described with equal parts admiration and suspicion. Then, one cold October afternoon, he walked into the community library where I volunteered. He was thinner than I remembered. His silver hair was combed neatly back, but his face had the gray, tired look I had seen on hundreds of patients during my years as a nurse. He held our high school yearbook against his chest. "Hello, Evie," he said. No one had called me that in 55 years. We had coffee that afternoon, then dinner 2 nights later. On our third meeting, he told me he had pancreatic cancer. His doctors had given him weeks, perhaps 2 months. "I don't want your pity," he said. "I want one honest ending." I should have asked what he meant. Instead, I reached across the table and held his hand. Over the next month, Thomas became part of my life with alarming ease. He brought soup when I caught a cold. He remembered that I hated carnations. He found the old blue Chevrolet in which we had gone to our senior dance, restored by a collector in Vermont, and drove me past the school one last time. Rachel distrusted him immediately. "Mom, he disappeared for 50 years and returned after becoming rich and terminally ill," she said. "That is not romantic. That is suspicious." I told her loneliness could make good things look dangerous. She answered, "And hope can make dangerous things look good." At the time, I thought she was being protective. Later, her words would keep me alive. Thomas proposed beside the frozen lake where we had once skated as teenagers. There was no expensive ring. He gave me the small silver band he had bought for me in 1971, but never had the courage to offer. "Marry me, Evie," he whispered. "It is my final wish." I said yes. We were married in my living room 4 days later. There were 12 guests, white roses, a chocolate cake, and an old recording of Unchained Melody. Thomas's adult son, Grant, arrived late and spent the ceremony staring at me as if I were stealing something from him. His daughter, Melissa, did not come at all. Thomas's lawyer, Samuel Price, served as a witness. Before signing the marriage certificate, he quietly asked to speak with Thomas in private. They argued in my kitchen. I could not hear every word, but I heard Samuel say, "If you go through with this, she becomes exposed." Thomas replied, "That is the point." When I entered, both men fell silent. Thomas kissed my forehead and said they had been discussing taxes. That was his first lie that I recognized. I married him anyway. For the first week, we were happy. Not the loud happiness of young people making plans, but the quiet happiness of 2 old souls borrowing time. We cooked simple meals, watched snow gather on the windows, and read our old letters aloud. But strange things began happening. Thomas received calls at night and walked into the garage to answer them. A dark SUV parked across the street twice. One morning, I found him burning papers in my fireplace. When I asked what they were, he smiled and said, "Old business." On the 10th night, he gave me a locked wooden box. "If anything happens," he said, "do not give this to Grant. Do not give it to Melissa. Give it only to Samuel." "Something is already happening?" I said. "Tell me the truth." He looked frightened not of death, but of someone living. "I am trying to correct an old mistake," he said. "I may have waited too long." 2 nights later, Thomas collapsed after drinking tea in our bedroom. His body convulsed. His breathing became shallow. I called 911 and began CPR, but he gripped my wrist with surprising strength. "Bluebird?" he gasped. It had been his high school nickname for me. Then he said 4 words I did not understand. "The lighthouse keeps accounts." He died before the ambulance arrived. The medical examiner called it a natural death complicated by late-stage cancer. Grant demanded an autopsy. then suddenly withdrew the request the following morning. Thomas was buried 6 days later. At the funeral, Grant accused me of marrying his father for money. Melissa asked whether Thomas had changed his will. I told them I knew nothing about his estate. That was when Grant leaned close and whispered, "You will." 3 hours later, Samuel Price knocked on my door. I invited him inside. He refused to remove his wet coat. "Where is the wooden box?" he asked. I pointed toward the upstairs bedroom. His face lost its color. "Evelyn, listen carefully. Thomas changed his life insurance policy 11 days before he died. You are the sole beneficiary of $5 million. I stared at him. I never knew he had a policy. The police received an anonymous message this afternoon. It claims you pressured him into marriage, altered his medication, and poisoned him when he refused to change his will. My knees weakened. Samuel caught my arm and lowered his voice. Thomas believed someone in his family had been stealing from his company for years. He thought marriage would protect certain evidence by moving it outside his estate. But if that evidence is missing, the marriage, the insurance money, and his death all point to you. Are you saying Thomas framed me? Samuel looked toward the stairs. I am saying you walked right into his trap. The question is whether he built it to destroy you, or to force you to finish what he could not. Then we heard glass break upstairs. Someone else was already inside my house. Samuel told me to stay behind him. We climbed the stairs slowly, listening to footsteps cross my bedroom. The window was open. Rain blew across the carpet. My dresser drawers had been emptied, the mattress lifted, and Thomas's clothes scattered across the floor. The wooden box was gone. Below us, the back door slammed. We reached the window in time to see a figure in a dark coat running through my garden toward a black SUV. I could not see the face, but I noticed a limp in the left leg. Grant Bennett had broken his left ankle playing college football. Even at the funeral, he still walked with that slight, uneven step. Samuel called the police. 2 officers searched the house, took photographs, and asked me question after question. Had anything valuable been in the box? Did I know its combination? Had Thomas seemed afraid? Had we argued? Then Detective Laura Chen arrived. She was calm, direct, and far more interested in my kitchen than the broken window. She collected Thomas's medicine, the tea tin, the electric kettle, and the cup from which he had drunk on the night he died. His death was certified as natural, I said. It was, she replied. That does not prevent us from taking another look. Before leaving, she told me not to travel. By morning the town knew. A local news site published photograph from our wedding beneath the headline Taramanine Lil Mela Onr, Dis Dias Aftiar Susiart Mar Iag. Grant told reporters that his father had been vulnerable. Melissa said she feared I had isolated him from his children. Neither mentioned that Thomas had invited them to visit, and they had repeatedly refused. My friends stopped calling. 2 people canceled their shifts with me at the library. Someone left a bottle of poison on my porch. Rachel came from Portland and insisted on staying with me. "We need our own lawyer," she said. Samuel advised us to hire criminal defense attorney Nina Alvarez, a former prosecutor with a reputation for refusing to be intimidated by wealthy families. Nina arrived carrying 1 notebook and asked me to tell the story from the beginning without making Thomas sound better than he was. That request changed everything. I admitted that he had lied about the argument with Samuel. I described the late calls, the burned papers, the SUV, and his final words. When I said, "The lighthouse keeps accounts," Nina stopped writing. Bellwether's old lighthouse had been converted into the corporate headquarters of Bennett Family Foundation. Grant served as chairman. Melissa ran its charitable programs. Nina looked at Samuel. "What accounts?" Samuel hesitated. Nina closed her notebook. "If you protect attorney-client secrets that could clear my client, I will make you explain that decision under oath." Samuel finally told us the truth. 3 years earlier, Thomas discovered that more than $18 million had vanished from Bennett Marine through false suppliers, inflated construction contracts, and donations to the family foundation. The documents appeared to carry his digital approval. He believed someone had stolen his identity and used his declining health to conceal the fraud. He suspected Grant, but he had no proof strong enough to survive a courtroom fight. Melissa controlled the foundation's records. The company's chief financial officer, Robert Keene, controlled the payment systems. Thomas had quietly hired a forensic accountant named Clara Webb. 2 months later, Clara died when her car went off an icy road. The police ruled it an accident. Thomas did not believe them. "Why did he marry me?" I asked. Samuel rubbed his forehead. "Spousal privilege. Estate control. And because no one in the scheme expected you. Thomas transferred a small voting block and a sealed evidence package to you through a marital trust. He believed the conspirators would expose themselves trying to recover it. So I was bait." Samuel did not answer. That silence hurt more than any answer could have. Thomas had loved me. I still believed that. But he had also placed me in danger without my informed consent. He had taken mice and turned it into a weapon. I wanted to hate him. Instead, I opened our old high school yearbook. Inside the back cover, beneath Thomas's faded message from 1971, someone had written 6 numbers, blue ink 1437211 Rachel suggested a bank box. Nina thought it might be a document index. I remembered the word Thomas had gasped first bluebird. In high school, Thomas and I had used a simple code. Numbers represented lines in poems we loved. The sequence pointed to a phrase in the poem he had read at our wedding. UND-IGHT. The lighthouse had 1 main lamp and 2 old navigation lights displayed in its small museum. Beneath the 3rd light was a brass plaque honoring Thomas's father. We went after closing. Samuel had a foundation key. Nina insisted on bringing Detective Chen, who agreed only after we told her about the break-in and the code. Behind the brass plaque, we found a narrow cavity. Inside was a flash drive wrapped in wax paper. The drive held spreadsheets, recorded phone calls, payment authorizations, and photographs of Grant meeting Robert Keene at a marina after midnight. But the most shocking file was a video Thomas had recorded 6 days before our wedding. He looked directly into the camera. "Evie, if you are seeing this, then I failed to tell you the truth in time. I married you because I love you. I also married you because you are the only person I trust. That does not excuse what I have done. I put a target on you. For that, I am sorry." He explained that the wooden box contained the original ledger from a secret account used to route stolen money. The flash drive was only a copy. Without the ledger, Grant's lawyers could claim the files had been manipulated. Then Thomas said something that made Detective Chen replay the video. "If I die after drinking anything prepared by my son, test for digoxin. My cancer medicine will disguise the symptoms unless someone knows what to look for." Detective Chen left immediately to request an emergency exhumation order. The next morning, Grant came to my house smiling. He carried the stolen wooden box. Grant placed the box on my kitchen table, as if he were returning a borrowed casserole dish. "You should lock your windows," he said. Rachel reached for her phone, but I signaled for her to wait. Nina had warned us that frightened people often willed more when they believed they were in control. "You broke into my home?" I said. Grant smiled. "Can you prove it?" The box was empty. He offered me a deal. I would renounce the insurance money, surrender every interest in Bennett Marine, and sign a statement saying Thomas had been confused during his final weeks. In return, Grant would tell the press that he no longer suspected me. And if I refuse? His smile disappeared. "The police will find evidence that you purchased heart medication online. They will find messages showing you asked my father to change his policy. They may even find the missing ledger in your house." It was not a threat shouted in anger. It was a schedule. That frightened me more. "Did you kill him?" I asked. Grant leaned across the table. "My father was already dead. His body simply had not accepted it." Rachel made a small sound behind me. Grant glanced at her, satisfied. Then he placed the agreement on the table and told me I had until noon the next day. After he left, Rachel revealed that she had recorded everything on her phone. Nina listened to it twice. "It is useful," she said, but he never confessed directly. A skilled defense attorney will call it grief anger and an unfortunate choice of words. Detective Chen returned with worse news. The court had approved Thomas's exhumation, but someone had already attempted to have his body cremated, using a forged authorization bearing my signature. The funeral home had stopped the process because an employee noticed the date was wrong. Someone was rushing to destroy evidence. That evening, we received the toxicology results from Thomas's cup. It contained digoxin, a heart medicine Thomas had never been prescribed. But his fingerprints were on the cup, and mine were on the tea tin and kettle. Grant's were nowhere. Then Nina asked a question no one else had considered. Who was in the house on the day Thomas died? I remembered a delivery from the Family Foundation, a basket of herbal teas, and a handwritten card from Melissa. One tin was labeled Sell Eep Wheel. The delivery driver's photograph showed the basket on my porch at 20:14 p.m. Securage from a neighbor showed Melissa's car, arriving 20 minutes earlier and leaving 5 minutes before the delivery. She had entered through the side door using Thomas's old key. Detective Chen obtained a warrant for Melissa's home. They found no digoxin, but they found 12 empty bottles with pharmacy labels removed and a document shredder filled with strips of Bennett Foundation bank records. Melissa was arrested for evidence destruction. She denied killing her father and demanded to speak with me. Against Nina's advice, I agreed. We met in an interview room at the county jail. Melissa looked smaller without her expensive coat and controlled smile. Grant will let me take the blame, she said. Did you poison the tea? I replaced one tin. Robert gave it to me. He said it would make Dad sleep and stop him from signing papers. I didn't know it could kill him. I did not believe all of that, but I believed she was afraid of her brother. Melissa explained that Grant had run the fraud for 7 years. Robert created fake vendors. Melissa moved money through the foundation and told herself they were only borrowing from their inheritance. When Thomas began investigating, Grant arranged Clara Webb's car crash by paying a mechanic to damage her brake line. "Where is the ledger?" I asked. Melissa looked toward the camera in the corner. Grant put it where the police would find it and blame you. Your basement, behind the old furnace. Detective Chen's team searched my basement. They found the ledger exactly where Melissa said it would be, inside a plastic bag containing a bottle of digoxin and printed receipts in my name. The trap was complete. But Grant had made one mistake. The basement floor was coated with fine white dust from repairs performed 2 months earlier. My shoes had left clear tracks during the police search. The bag, however, was surrounded by an older set of prints made by a large shoe with a worn outer heel. Grant's left shoe wore down unevenly because of his old injury. Detective Chen obtained another warrant. At Grant's home, officers found shoes that matched the prints, encrypted messages from Robert, and a photograph of my basement furnace taken the day Thomas died. But Grant was gone. So was Robert Keene. At 9:30 the next morning, Samuel received notice of an emergency Bennett Marine Board meeting. Grant planned to remove Thomas's remaining directors, sell the company's shipyard, and transfer the proceeds to an offshore buyer. The meeting would begin at 11. I looked at the agreement Grant had left on my kitchen table. Then I looked at the wedding ring Thomas had given me. For 12 days, I had been treated like a foolish widow who had been tricked by love. Grant believed shame would make me hide. He believed age made me weak. He believed I would trade the truth for peace. He did not understand that I had spent 42 years as an emergency nurse. I had held pressure on wounds while families screamed. I had made decisions when every second mattered. I knew the difference between panic and action. "Samuel," I said, "how many voting shares did Thomas place in the marital trust?" "Enough to decide the meeting if combined with his retained block." "And who controls that block now?" He finally smiled. His surviving spouse. At 10:55, I walked into Bennett Marine's boardroom. Grant was sitting in his father's chair. The boardroom overlooked the shipyard, where Thomas had worked beside his father as a boy. Through the windows, steel hulls rested beneath enormous cranes, and hundreds of employees moved between the buildings. Grant had spent years treating those people as numbers. By noon, he planned to sell their jobs to save himself. He stood when he saw me. For the first time, his confidence cracked. "You are under criminal investigation," he said. "You cannot be here." "I am a shareholder," I replied. "And your father's legal spouse." Samuel placed the trust documents on the table. Nina placed a court order beside them, preventing the sale of company assets until the fraud investigation was complete. Grant laughed, but the sound was thin. "My sister gave you a story to save herself. That is all you have." "No," I said. "We also have the ledger." His eyes flicked toward Robert's empty chair. That tiny movement told Detective Chen everything she needed to know. She and 2 federal agents entered through the side door. Grant tried to leave. The agents stopped him. Nina played Rachel's recording. Then Samuel played Thomas's video. Finally, Detective Chen explained that Robert Keene had been arrested at a private airfield 40 minutes earlier. Faced with charges for fraud, conspiracy, evidence tampering, and murder, Robert had agreed to cooperate. He had already confessed that Grant ordered him to obtain the digoxin. Melissa placed it in the tea. Grant entered my house later, made the drink while I was upstairs helping Thomas change his clothes, and wiped every surface he touched. After Thomas collapsed, Grant used remote access to delete part of my home security recording. He thought he had erased it permanently. He had not known that Thomas paid for automatic cloud backups. The restored footage showed Grant entering the kitchen at 6:42 p.m., opening the altered tea tin, and pouring liquid from a small bottle into Thomas's cup. Grant stopped pretending. He turned toward me with hatred in his face. "He chose you over his own children," he said. "No," I answered. "He chose the truth over the children who betrayed him." The agents handcuffed him in his father's chair. But I was not finished. The board voted to remove Grant immediately. Robert was terminated. Melissa resigned from the foundation. I used Thomas's shares to block the shipyard sale and appoint an independent management team. The company would not be broken apart to pay for the Bennett family's crimes. Over the following year, Grant and Robert were convicted on federal fraud charges. Grant was also convicted of Thomas's murder and conspiracy in Clara Webb's death. Robert received a reduced sentence for his cooperation. Melissa pleaded guilty to manslaughter, money laundering, and evidence destruction. She testified against her brother and still went to prison. The stolen money that could be recovered was returned to Bennett Marine. The family foundation was dissolved. Its remaining assets created the Clara Webb Fund, which protects whistleblowers and supports families harmed by corporate fraud. And the $5 million insurance policy. I refused to keep it. Grant expected that money to make me look guilty. Instead, I used every dollar to establish pensions for workers who would have lost everything in the planned sale. The first person to receive help was a welder named Luis, whose wife needed cancer treatment. That felt like justice Thomas might have understood. Months later, Samuel delivered one final letter. Thomas had written it the morning of our wedding and instructed Samuel to get to me only after the case ended. Evie, if you are reading this, then you know the worst thing about me. I loved you, and I used your love because fear made me believe I had no other choice. I cannot ask you to forgive that. A trap does not become kindness merely because it catches a guilty man. But one part was never false. When I asked you to marry me, I was not acting. The boy behind the high school gym loved you. The old man beside the frozen lake loved you. In between, I wasted too many years believing there would always be more time. Do not spend what remains of your life defending my memory. Tell the truth about me, all of it, and then be free. Thomas, I read the letter twice. Then I placed it beside our high school yearbook and allowed myself to cry. People later asked whether I regretted marrying him. The honest answer is complicated. Thomas gave me 12 beautiful days, and he stole my right to choose the danger that came with them. He trusted my strength, but he did not respect my freedom. Love and betrayal can live in the same heart. That is what makes betrayal hurt so deeply. I forgave him eventually, but forgiveness did not mean pretending his actions were noble. It meant refusing to let his final mistake define the rest of my life. I remained on Bennett Marine Board for 2 years. We gave employees seats at the table, strengthened oversight, and rebuilt the company without the family secrets that had nearly destroyed it. On my 76th birthday, I stepped down and returned to the library. Rachel gave me a framed photograph from the wedding. In it, Thomas was looking at me as though 55 missing years had collapsed into a single moment. I keep that photograph, but I also keep a copy of the court judgment. One reminds me that love can return when we least expect it. The other reminds me never to confuse love with blind trust. Grant thought Thomas's trap would bury me beside him. Instead, I opened it, followed every wire, and closed it around the people who believed an old woman would be too frightened to fight back. I was 73 when I became a bride, 73 when I became a widow, and 73 when a powerful family tried to make me their scapegoat. They mistook my kindness for weakness. That was the trap they walked into.